Greeks had lived in Asia Minor for over 2,000 years, but that history came to a bloody end thanks to the genocide committed against them by the Ottoman and Turkish governments. Alongside the Armenians and Assyrians, the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire faced a wave of deportation, dehumanization, and destruction during and after the First World War, which are remembered as some of the bloodiest genocides of the 20th century. Today, on A Day in History, we look at how the Greek population of modern-day Turkey was all but exterminated. The Greek, Armenian, and Assyrian genocides were similar in many ways, but the defining feature of their victims was obvious: Christianity. These three minorities represented the vast majority of Christians who lived under the Muslim Ottoman Empire. Political events also put the empire's Greeks in a vulnerable position. Greece had secured independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1823. It was a deep wound to Ottoman pride, made even worse by the continual decay of Ottoman power ever since. As resentment against the new Greek nation simmered, it filtered down and fell upon the Greek minority too. The sparks of genocide began smoldering as early as 1908 with the Young Turk Revolution. The Young Turks were a hyper-nationalist faction who believed in an ethnically Turkish Muslim empire. Their policy of Turkification left no room for non-Turks or non-Muslims, and soon every ethnic minority in the empire was in their crosshairs. In these last years of Ottoman power in Europe, Ottoman authorities harassed ethnic Greeks to encourage them to relocate to Greece itself. Episodes of violence broke out in areas like Thessaloniki and Macedonia, where ethnic Greek leaders were known to disappear or where the bodies of Greek farmers would be found in the wilderness, left behind by Ottoman authorities. But such violence was intermittent and not yet systemic. The Ottomans mainly relied on indirect methods to engage in ethnic cleansing at this stage. Making the Greeks and other Christians leave on their own was easier and less likely to be condemned than removing them with violence. The Ottoman authorities therefore encouraged boycotts of Greek and Armenian businesses to economically and socially isolate them. These boycotts also came with episodes of violence, but disarmament politics enacted by the Ottomans sought to deny the Greeks the chance to protect themselves from it, and the legal system would certainly be no help. Meanwhile, the Ottomans resettled Muslims in Greek areas, and armed settlers at that, to put even more pressure on Greeks to leave. The situation of Greeks and other Christians in the empire was worsened by Ottoman failures in the Balkan Wars between 1912 and 1913. The empire lost almost all of its remaining European territory, save for areas of Thrace, to the Christian Balkan League, and it's perhaps this embarrassment that pushed the Ottomans to even more violent methods. Many of the empire's Christians did choose to flee in the face of rising persecution, but those who stayed faced a wave of intense persecution from 1913. Wholesale massacres occurred in Greek villages near Gallipoli by July of that year. One eyewitness reported villages being left without a house standing, and in others the population was tied up, executed, and burned. As with the Armenian and Assyrian genocides, the Ottomans employed irregular militias and unofficial volunteers in these massacres to give themselves some level of deniability. These methods continued into 1914. One Danish diplomat wrote in his report to his government of armed militias attacking villages and villagers being murdered in their fields or along the roads. The details of what took place are harrowing, he wrote. Women were seduced, girls were ravaged, some of them dying from ill treatment received, and even children were not spared. The goal was intimidation. Every village burned might encourage 100 more to flee. On 14th of May 1914, Minister of the Interior and functionally dictator Talat Pasha ordered the cleansing of Greek settlements all along the coast of the Aegean Sea. Local governments were told to encourage Greeks to leave voluntarily, but violence was accepted and inevitable. One victim of this violence was the coastal town of Phasia. Turkish militias descended on the town on June 12, 1914, moving from building to building, eliminating any civilians they came across. The violence sent the town into panic. Hundreds piled onto boats and fled by sea. Others sought sanctuary. A team of French archaeologists in the town managed to save several hundred people by sheltering them in buildings flying the French flag. But perhaps 100 civilians were senselessly murdered in a matter of hours, and virtually all of the population was forced to leave. The first phase of deportations and genocide between 1913 and 1914 led to about 115,000 Greeks from Thrace and 150,000 from the Aegean coast fleeing to Greece. Tens of thousands more were relocated within the Ottoman Empire, where they would either be deported at a later date, culturally assimilated, or in many cases, simply killed. The number of dead Greeks is not fully known at this stage, but a reliable estimate is somewhere in the tens of thousands. The eruption of the First World War had a complicated effect on the treatment of Greeks. Fears of a Russian invasion causing an Armenian uprising in the east drew Ottoman attention their way. Talat Pasha ordered a halt to deportations and massacres in the western reaches of the empire, if only to avoid antagonizing neutral Greece. Still, the threat of an ethnic Greek rebellion to accompany an invasion by a Christian power, such as Britain, kept the Ottoman authorities weary, and they found ways to continue their genocide anyway. Although mass killings and burning of villages still occurred, the bulk of extermination occurred through forced labor and deportation, which became known as white massacres. Wartime conscription applied to Greeks, but arming them while persecuting them would have been foolish. Instead, young Greek men were conscripted into forced labor battalions, who were assigned grueling physical labor across the empire. These labor battalions were a tacit form of genocide. Cut off from their homes, underfed, and overworked, many of the men who were taken were never expected to make it home. The targeting of men was a useful security measure too. Men were more likely to fight back if they saw what the Ottomans were doing to the women and children left behind, a problem easily solved by forcing them into labor battalions. A Greek diplomat who witnessed one of these labor battalions in 1917 sent a grim report back to Athens. "I saw those wretched men in the hospitals, stretched upon their beds or on the ground, resembling living skeletons, longing for death to end their sufferings." Casualty rates were so high that it was not practical to dig individual graves for everyone. The bodies of the workers who fell were dumped into mass graves, if they were even buried at all. An estimated 200,000 men were forced into these labor battalions, with perhaps 3/4 of them dying before the end of the war. The other pillar of the white massacres was deportation, in the form of the infamous death marches. Although more strongly associated with the Armenians, tens of thousands of Greeks perished on miserable marches to their new settlement sites. Remaining Greek populations who could not be removed from the empire altogether were relocated to the interior by foot. The logic was that the coastal regions were more vulnerable in the case of an Entente invasion, and dispersing the Greeks among the Muslim and Turkish population inland would help to stamp out their culture. Starvation, dehydration, exhaustion, disease, and mistreatment by the Ottoman or militia guards led to a high attrition rate on the death marches, leaving aside the intentional massacres that occurred along the routes. For more on the death marches, check out our video on the Armenian and Assyrian genocides too. Experiences of genocide often changed by region. The Greeks of the Pontus region along the Black Sea suffered especially harsh treatment. Here, the persecution was overseen by Topal Osman. Osman systematized massacres in outlying Greek villages across Pontus, often gathering the population of a village together in a church or house before setting it on fire, in order to save time compared to burning every building individually. Elsewhere, Greeks in the east, and especially those who lived in close proximity to Armenians or Assyrians, saw their genocides intertwine. Despite their differences in language, ethnicity, and the particularities of their faith, the Christians of the Ottoman Empire often shared the same mass graves. For example, in the province of Diyarbakir, an estimated 200,000 Christians were killed in a few months in 1915, upon the orders of Governor Reshid Bey. Most of them Assyrians or Armenians, but among them were thousands of Greeks. By late 1916, Entente forces were occupying islands in the Aegean Sea. Russia was advancing in the Black Sea region, and Greece was increasingly likely to join the war effort against the Ottomans. In response, Ottoman deportation policy intensified in the latter half of the war. Entire towns and districts were designated for depopulation into the interior, subjecting tens of thousands to death marches and other violence. The Pontus region was thoroughly depopulated, out of fear that they would join the advancing Russians. In Samsun province in Pontus, the Greeks were given only a few hours' notice before their deportation. The deportations inevitably went hand in hand with looting, burning, and other crimes, but the Ottomans forced survivors to sign affidavits that officially blamed Armenians for the violence. There were, of course, practically no Armenians left in Pontus at that time. This pattern of deportation, abuse, and outright massacre continued until the Ottoman surrender in October 1918, although this was only a pause, not the end of the genocide. By this point, the removal of Assyrian and Armenian populations was almost entirely complete, and a huge portion of the Greeks had also been removed. In a way, the genocide had already been mostly successful. The Armistice of Mudros on October 30th, 1918 demanded that the Ottomans allow deported Greeks to return home, but the survivors would only find their homes looted, destroyed, or resettled. Furthermore, those who returned home merely opened themselves to persecution when the genocide resumed a few months later. Post-war arrangements saw the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire and the partition of its territory between Britain, France, Italy, and Greece. The vestigial Ottoman authority was quickly challenged by a new Turkish nationalist movement, who sought an independent, ethnically pure Turkish nation in Anatolia. At the center of this movement was Mustafa Kemal Pasha, later known as Ataturk, who would soon reignite the genocide during his fight for Turkish independence. On May 15, 1919, Greek forces landed at the city of Smyrna with the approval of the Entente powers. Greece had been granted permission to occupy the region for security reasons, under the Armistice of Mudros. Smyrna was an ancient city with a large Greek majority population, and for the Greeks, occupying it was a valid strategic choice. It was also a way for them to protect ethnic Greeks from the persecution other Greeks had been enduring for years. For the Turkish nationalists, it was an invasion into the heartland of their idealized post-imperial Turkish nation. The landing at Smyrna is widely considered to be the start of the Greco-Turkish War. Ataturk was dispatched to Pontus shortly after the Greek occupation of Smyrna. Although it was hundreds of miles removed from the Greek occupation, Ataturk ensured that Pontus was punished for the perceived injustices of their fellow Greeks. The Turkish nationalists openly encouraged mob violence against Greeks and called on Turks to clear their land of, quote, faithless dogs. Over 300 Pontic villages were destroyed, their population almost entirely killed in this persecution after the First World War. By May 1922, Greek military sources reported with despair that practically the entire Greek population of Pontus had been eliminated. Full-scale conflict erupted between Turkey and Greece shortly after the landing at Smyrna. Greece pushed into inland Anatolia through 1920 and 1921, until the nationalist forces under Ataturk, who had assumed effective power over a new Turkish nation, launched a powerful counteroffensive which drove the Greeks back and out of Smyrna by September 1922. Atrocities were reported on both sides over the 3 years of fighting. The Greeks often took violent revenge on the Turkish civilians for the crimes of the Ottomans and Turkish authorities, while the Turks answered Ataturk's call for ethnic cleansing, with a continuation of the Ottoman-era policies of massacre and deportation. The Izmit region in northwest Anatolia, just east of Istanbul, was a typical victim. Greek and Turkish forces were present and fighting in the region from 1920. There, at least 32 villages were burned and 12,000 people were massacred, as the Turks mopped up the last remaining Greeks who hadn't already been deported or killed in previous persecutions. Greek journalist Kostas Faltaitis visited the region during that time and wrote of the horrors he saw. "There is nothing left today except ashes and ruins, and the endless corpses of human skeletons that are scattered in the mountains, in the fields, in the forests, and in the ravines." The bloody capstone of the war and the genocide came in September 1922, where the Turkish forces retook Smyrna. Greek citizens were beaten, tortured, and killed en masse in an orgy of violence committed by the victorious Turks. Among the victims was Bishop Chrysostomos Kalafatis, the leading Christian figure of the city, who was handed over to a mob and lynched. Eyewitnesses reported him being stripped, mutilated, and dragged through the street until he expired. On September 13th, a fire broke out in the city. Turkish sources blamed the Greeks, but eyewitnesses reported Turkish soldiers setting fire to Greek homes as the start of it. The fire spread and utterly consumed the Greek and Armenian quarters of the city, but thankfully spared the Muslim and Jewish area. It took several days for the fire to burn out. Estimates for the dead in the burning of Smyrna range from 10,000 to 100,000 or more. Almost all of them were ethnic Greeks. The survivors escaped by piling onto boats in the harbor or huddling on the docks, where Turkish forces kept them contained for days. With their homes destroyed and the Turkish nationalists victorious, the scattered Greek survivors of Smyrna left for Greece, some voluntarily, others deported by the nationalists. The burning of Smyrna was a symbolic end, not just to the war or even to the Greek genocide, but to 2,000 years of Greek settlement in Asia Minor. The Greco-Turkish War came to an end with the Treaty of Lausanne in July 1923. In the terms of the treaty, Turkey and Greece agreed on an unprecedented population exchange. Turkey's over 1 million ethnic Greeks would be deported to Greece, while Greece's 500,000 Muslims would be deported to Turkey. The population exchange was an assurance of peace and protection, but it was also a chilling conclusion to a saga of persecution. In the end, it ensured that the Greek genocide was almost entirely successful. The Ottomans and then the Turks had wanted only one thing: to get rid of the Greeks. They were willing to do anything to achieve that end: murder, virtual slavery, assimilation, or deportation. As long as they were gone, the perpetrators did not care. That is not to say the treaty was wrong. The population exchange almost certainly saved countless Greeks, and indeed Muslims, from persecution in their original countries. However, it is a grim lesson from history that genocides achieve their stated goals far more often than we'd like to admit. As with all genocides, casualty estimates vary wildly. There were between 2 and 3 million Greeks in Asia Minor at the start of the First World War, and barely a handful left by the end of the Lausanne population exchanges. Scholarly estimates fall somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million dead, with many more deported to Greece or escaping elsewhere into Europe or Russia. Like its Armenian and Assyrian counterparts, justice for the genocide was practically non-existent. Recognition has also been rare, even more so than for the Armenians. Efforts to build peace between Greece and Turkey, especially during the Cold War when they were ostensibly allies, meant that Greece did not push the issue of genocide recognition in the decades afterwards. Greece only officially recognized the genocide in 1994, and only 8 other countries, including Armenia, Germany, and the United States, have officially recognized it. As one might expect, Turkey does not admit any wrongdoing. Moreover, the personal involvement of Ataturk in the persecution of Greeks makes the Greek genocide an especially thorny issue for nationalists, who have, at various times, wavered between denial or celebration of the anti-Greek actions of Turkey's premier national hero. Still, the genocide's legacy lives on in the millions of people whose ancestors were killed or displaced, in the ethnic makeup of the regions where Greeks were murdered or torn away, and in the tension that endures between Greece and Turkey to this day. The 20th century had no shortage of terrible events that cast a shadow over people today. The deaths of over 1 million Armenians is one such tragedy. Few tragedies have faced such bitter political discussion after the fact as the Armenian genocide. While many people recognize the events as a genocide, others deny it ever happened, insist it was an accident, or that it was a justified response to a political threat. In this video, we look at the unspeakable things that happened in the Armenian genocide, and how its complicated legacy is still hotly debated today. Nestled in the Caucasus Mountains on the border between Europe and Asia, Armenia's long history has seen it caught between countless empires. By the late 19th century, Western Armenia was firmly under the control of the Ottoman Empire, while a smaller eastern portion was controlled by the Russians. The Armenians of the Ottoman Empire faced many obstacles. As a Christian minority in a Muslim-majority empire, they were subject to legal discrimination and higher taxes. Over time, racial ideologies that privileged ethnic Turks opened new opportunities for anti-Armenian discrimination. Another significant obstacle was their role as a middleman minority. A middleman minority is an ethnic group that is overrepresented in occupations like bankers, merchants, and bureaucrats relative to their small overall population. Other middleman minorities around the world included the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Gujaratis in India. Although only a small percentage of Armenians worked in these lucrative jobs, all Armenians were subject to discrimination that described them as parasites, thieves, and leeches, who were stealing the wealth of the rest of the population. This caused outbreaks of violence and persecution throughout the late 19th century. The Ottoman government regularly seized Armenian land to redistribute to Muslim and Kurdish settlers, and the Kurdish Hamidian regiments were given free rein to raid Armenian villages as part of their resettlement. Despite attempts to muster international support, the Armenians were left to defend themselves and formed a number of impromptu militia groups to defend their towns. But the Ottoman authorities interpreted this as a sign of rebellion and cracked down hard in the 1890s. In 1894, thousands of Armenians were massacred in the town of Sasun following a dispute over taxes. International condemnation of the massacre only seemed to anger the Ottoman authorities and the general population. A surge of violence in 1895 and 1896, known as the Hamidian massacres, killed up to 300,000 Armenians. Episodes of violence continued into the 1900s, such as the Adana massacre in 1909, which took over 20,000 Armenian lives. These massacres are not considered part of the main Armenian genocide, but they show that the genocide wasn't an isolated incident. Armenians were being murdered for decades beforehand, and the true genocide was merely an evolution of what was already happening. Two changes turned this irregular persecution into a full-blown genocide. The first was the rise of the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP. The CUP was a radical party that wanted to end absolute monarchy in the empire. It also had a strong ethno-nationalist agenda, calling for the Turkification of the Ottoman Empire. The CUP took power in 1913 under the leadership of Mehmed Talat, also known as Talat Pasha, who effectively ran a one-party dictatorship. Sultan Abdulhamid remained an important figurehead, but it was the CUP who steered the country's course. The CUP was avidly pro-Muslim and turned a blind eye to the mob violence against Christians, including the Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrian minorities of the empire. The other factor was the First World War. In November 1914, the Ottomans joined Germany and Austria-Hungary against the Entente powers of Britain, France, and especially Russia. Russia was particularly problematic because it bordered Ottoman territory and controlled parts of Armenia. Russia was also Orthodox Christian and had a strong kinship with the Armenians. The CUP used the war as a pretext to clamp down on numerous minorities in the empire. For example, in November 1914, they seized land and guns from Jewish settlers in Palestine and redistributed their territory to Muslim settlers. Syriac Orthodox Christians and Nestorians also found themselves in the government's crosshairs, but naturally, it was the Armenians who'd suffer the most. The Russian army quickly poured into Armenia, inflicting a series of defeats on the Ottoman forces. After years of persecution, many Armenians welcomed the Russians as brothers and liberators. As Ottoman forces retreated from the frontier, however, they began attacking and looting Armenian villages, even if they'd done nothing to support the Russians. To the Ottomans, all of the Armenians were now potential traitors. The tipping point came in the Armenian-dominated city of Van in eastern Anatolia. With the Russians closing in, the Ottomans feared that it would become the center of an Armenian rebellion. In early 1915, Ottoman forces under the command of regional governor Cevdet Bey began the systematic extermination of dozens of Armenian villages in the area. As many as 55,000 Armenians were killed around Van. In April 1915, after Bey had executed many Armenian leaders and begun planning the extermination of all fighting-age Armenian males inside the city itself, the Armenian population finally took up arms in earnest. The Armenian rebels managed to withstand Ottoman attacks on the city for weeks, until an approaching Russian army forced the Ottomans into retreat. For the Armenians of Van, it was a victory, but Armenians elsewhere in the empire would not be so lucky. The fighting at Van terrified Talat Pasha. After word reached him of Armenian resistance, Talat struck decisively to destroy any potential leadership for an Armenian rebellion. On the 24th of April, hundreds of influential Armenians, including priests, politicians, journalists, and academics, were arrested. They were detained, deported, and most would be killed. Similar orders came down across the empire. Any potential Armenian leadership was completely decapitated. To this day, the 24th of April is widely marked as the start of the Armenian genocide. At the core of the genocide was the Tekir Law, or the Temporary Law of Deportation, passed in May 1915. This ordered the mass resettlement of Armenians away from vulnerable regions and into more easily controlled areas of the empire. The aim was to break up Armenian communities and prevent any organized Armenian resistance from forming. These new settlements also had strict conditions. They had to be more than 25 kilometers from a railway line, there could be no more than 50 households in one settlement, and the total Armenian population couldn't exceed 10% of the local Muslim population. Starting in June 1915, the government started liquidating and redistributing Armenian property as part of the displacement process. Ottoman authorities reallocated land to Muslims and seized everything from family heirlooms to livestock, while Armenian businesses were shut down or given to Muslim owners. There was no legal route for the Armenians to oppose any of this. Talat openly declared that he wanted an economy controlled entirely by Muslims. There was no place for Armenians in his vision of the future. Where Armenians weren't deported, many were simply massacred. In one such massacre in Diyarbakir, the regional governor had 700 Christians, most of them Armenians, rounded up in the middle of the night, and in the words of a German diplomatic observer, had them slaughtered like sheep. Talat himself wrote to the governor to complain. He was only supposed to be killing Armenians, not all Christians, and in the future he had to be more specific in his murder. But the vast majority of the death came from the now infamous death marches. Lacking sufficient transport or railroad infrastructure, the deportation of Armenians occurred mostly on foot. Whole villages and towns were forced to march hundreds of miles from their homes to the new designated settlement sites. These marches forced their victims through harsh deserts with little food, water, or shelter. With the army occupied by the war, so-called specialist groups oversaw these marches. These unofficial militias gave the government plausible deniability, which the Turkish government has relied upon ever since, and put the victims in the hands of thousands of undisciplined and unaccountable men. The death marches earned their name from the outset. The pretext for the deportations was potential rebellion, and it is always men who are more likely to fight. Fighting-age men and boys were singled out, separated from the women and children, and executed. Tens of thousands of men and boys died in this way, leaving behind traumatized and vulnerable families of women and children who were easily preyed upon by the guards overseeing the marches. Starvation and exhaustion killed hundreds every day. The Armenians were barely given enough food to survive. In some cases, elderly Armenians starved themselves so that the children could have their rations instead. The marches didn't stop for the dead, leaving the routes littered with the corpses of those who'd been left behind. Massacres were commonplace along the death marches. Guards would stop the Armenians at specific sites and select a portion to be killed off, either to make things easier to handle or simply for sadistic pleasure. Sometimes the guards bargained with the victims, offering to spare them if they gave up any last possessions they were holding. Some sites saw multiple massacres as new waves of deported Armenians were marched by and killed. The shores of Lake Khazar near Harput, the valley south of Firingilar near Malasha, and the Kema Gorge near Erzincan were just some of the places that saw multiple massacres spread out over the genocide. Locations like these were chosen because they weren't too far from major roads, but were out of sight enough that people wouldn't easily find the corpses. At Kema Gorge, victims were thrown from the cliffs and into the river below, so their bodies would be carried away. Sometimes the killers searched the bodies for trinkets or legal documents that they could present to the government and claim to be the legal heirs of what little property or wealth the victims still had. Death and starvation were not the only crimes victims faced. Since most men were killed in the early phases of the deportations, the death marches were predominantly for women and children. Inevitably, sexual violence was widespread. The guards regularly committed such acts on marches, sometimes in exchange for sparing their lives or those of their children, although these promises weren't always honored. A number of Armenian women found themselves thrown into sexual slavery instead. One chief of police reported that the governor regularly gave him young Armenian girls as sex slaves as a reward for his services. In a disturbing report from one foreign aid worker in 1926, she claimed that of the thousands of survivors that she had spoken to, only one had not been sexually abused. A handful of Armenians escaped these fates. Armenians with essential work skills, particularly for the war effort, could be exempted from deportation. Catholic and Protestant Armenians also had a higher chance to evade persecution, since the empire's German and Austro-Hungarian allies might be angry if the government targeted them too. However, from November 1915, there was immense social and political pressure for these Armenians to convert to Islam to avoid future deportation. By 1916, almost all Armenians in the interior and eastern provinces had been deported. Entire districts had been completely emptied of Armenians. Their primary destination was a network of camps along the lower Euphrates River. In these camps, the desperate and traumatized survivors of the death marches faced continued violence, starvation, dehydration, and disease. They were prohibited from most forms of employment, denying them what little chances they had to earn an income to improve their condition. Some would survive to be resettled into new artificial villages. However, the camps and settlements quickly became overcrowded, as the empire's disparate Armenian population was shoved into a tiny corner of the empire. Worse, the strict limits on Armenian populations relative to the Muslim majority were still enforced. When Talat ordered a count of the Armenian population in 1916, the governor of nearby Deir ez-Zor massacred thousands of people to lower his share. Firing squads executed people and dumped their bodies in the river, with some reports suggesting that 1,000 children were burned. The deportations had also created another problem: orphans. Many parents sacrificed themselves to protect and provide for their children, which left an epidemic of orphaned Armenians in the camps and strung out along the routes of the death marches. Many ended up in virtual slavery, and many more were taken to government orphanages or sent to Muslim families. Here, they would be stripped of their own language, culture, and faith, and assimilated into the wider Muslim and Turkish culture. By 1917, it seemed that the grim policies had worked. The Armenian population was decimated, and the survivors were contained in specific areas or dispersed and assimilated among the general population. Although suffering and killing continued, most of the genocide's victims had already been claimed. The end of the war brought the end of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the genocide. Armenian survivors and international observers began the difficult process of recovery and justice. Around 1.1 million Armenians were killed between 1914 and 1918. No more than 300,000 Armenians could be accounted for in imperial territory by the end of the genocide, although a few tens of thousands had escaped into Russia. With so many dead, especially among men and the elderly, the social order and communities of the Armenians were destroyed. It would take decades to begin to rebuild, and the scars are still present today. Efforts to hold people accountable were disappointing. The post-war government quickly blamed the CUP, but most of its leaders, including Talat Pasha, fled. The legal framework necessary to charge people with crimes against humanity simply didn't exist at the time, and as a result, most escaped any legal consequences. This was especially the case into the 1920s, when Turkish nationalist movements emerged which eagerly defended the CUP, and either denied or celebrated the genocide as necessary to the emergence of the Turkish nation. But not all consequences have to be legal. A small network of Armenians began Operation Nemesis, a covert plan to enact vigilante justice on the genocide's perpetrators. Several leading figures were assassinated in the years following the genocide. Talat Pasha himself was shot dead in Berlin by Sogomon Tehlirian, whose entire family had been wiped out in the genocide. After a 2-day trial where Tehlirian openly admitted to killing Talat, he was found not guilty by a German court and walked free. The Armenian genocide is a topic fraught with controversy today. The Turkish government officially denies that it happened. it blames the deaths on uncontrollable circumstances and justified suppression of a supposed Armenian rebellion. Denial or downplaying of the Armenian genocide has become wrapped up in Turkish nationalism, and discussion of the topic is met with suppression and censorship inside Turkey. Most historians disagree and see it as a clear genocide. They point out the obvious links between government policy and the deaths, as well as the many examples of state-ordered or state-endorsed massacres to oppose the government's claims. While starvation, disease, and exhaustion did kill many of the victims, these were not accidental or unexpected, but obvious and probably intentional results of the policy. Historians argued that the areas the Armenians were sent to could never have supported the Armenian population sent to them. The deaths of hundreds of thousands on the death marches or in the camps was tacitly expected by the Ottomans and helped along by massacres. Furthermore, the argument that it was a justified military response to rebellion is debunked by the fact that the vast majority of victims were never rebels or from rebel communities, and that women and children were killed and deported anyway. Nor can fears of them joining the Russians be justified, since most deported Armenians came from areas that were nowhere near the front lines. Even if Talat and his government never set out a coherent plan to kill Armenians, their policies consistently and knowingly killed over 1 million Armenians, and they willfully refused to alter those policies at any point despite seeing their consequences. Outside of Turkey, the genocide is still controversial. Many nations, including the United States, Germany, and Russia, recognize the event as a genocide. Organizations like the Catholic Church and United Nations have similarly agreed. However, for a number of reasons, most countries have not. Israel has attracted special criticism for not recognizing the genocide, and it's widely believed that Israel's silence is to avoid alienating Turkey as a potential ally. Similar concerns are probably behind China's avoidance of the issue, although Chinese officials have been known to participate in recognition events of the genocide. Overall, just 34 governments officially recognize the event as a genocide, but the populations of many non-recognizing countries, like the United Kingdom, overwhelmingly support such recognition. Today, relations between Armenia and Turkey are delicate and hostile because of their tragic history together. Turkey furiously denies that it did anything wrong, but this denial rings hollow in the eyes of the Armenian people, who still carry the legacy of the crimes inflicted upon their predecessors. It seems impossible that we would forget genocides of entire people, but events like the Assyrian genocide show us how fickle human memory can be. Also called the Saifo, meaning the sword, the Assyrian genocide was one of 3 mass campaigns of extermination waged by the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. Alongside the more famous Armenian genocide and that of the Greeks, hundreds of thousands of Assyrians lost their lives in racially and religiously motivated atrocities at the command of the Ottoman government between 1914 and 1918. The struggle of the Assyrians is easily overlooked, but it contains tales of incredible brutality and of admirable resistance. Today, on A Day in History, we look at how the atrocities of the Saifo unfolded, the deplorable ways that the Ottomans deceived their victims, and the stories of the men who took up arms to defend themselves from those who would exterminate them. The Assyrians are an ethnic group united by their shared languages which derive from ancient Aramaic. They are also thoroughly Christian, although split between several denominations, of which the largest are the Orthodox Assyrian Church of the East and Syrian Orthodox Church and the Chaldean Catholic Church. Unlike the Armenians, the Assyrians have never been politically unified. There is no real link between the ancient Assyrian Empire and the modern Assyrian people, and they were treated as a loose ethnic group with no fixed territory. Like other Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire, they faced sporadic violence and persecution for decades before the genocide. In 1895, Assyrians were among the victims of the waves of violence that killed thousands of Christians across the empire, and they faced regular discrimination in law and public life. Violence from Turkish authorities and Kurdish raiders continued throughout the early 20th century, with land seizures, forced conversion, and mob violence becoming regular features of life. Things changed with the rise of Turkish ethno-nationalism in the First World War. The empire's new ruler Talat Pasha envisioned an ethnically Turkish empire where minorities were excluded or eliminated. The Ottomans also saw the Assyrians as a security risk, fearing that they would side with Russia once the fighting began. In October 1914, Talat Pasha issued a decree ordering the deportation and expulsion of Assyrians away from border territories with Russia and Iran, due to their predisposition to be influenced by foreigners. These deportations were more than resettlements. They were designed to destroy the culture, language, and social structure of the Assyrians by splitting up communities and isolating Assyrians in more easily managed locations. No more than 20 Assyrians would be settled together in these new settlements, and Talat declared, "We should not let them return to their homelands." Ottoman forces began rounding up villages, often without even telling the Assyrians what was happening. Many of these Assyrians joined their Armenian counterparts on the infamous death marches, grueling treks through inhospitable terrain, where thousands died from exhaustion, starvation, dehydration, and massacres along the route. Many Assyrians fled across the border to Iran in the face of this new wave of persecution. But Ottoman forces violated Iranian territory to hunt down fleeing Assyrians along the border. In response, Russia began organizing arms and support for Assyrians and Armenians, who would then fight alongside Russian soldiers when the Russian campaigns in the region began later that year. Russian forces managed to capture several Assyrian towns from the Ottomans in November, but when an Ottoman counterattack recaptured them, they took revenge on their residents. At least 12 villages were wiped out by the returning Ottomans, regardless of whether they'd personally collaborated with the Russians. A fresh Ottoman army entered Azerbaijan in April 1915, but Russian forces, supported by desperate Armenian and Assyrian escapees, managed to repel them. The retreating Ottoman forces were furious and were quick to blame all Assyrians and Armenians for their defeat. They massacred Assyrian villages as they retreated, and Commander Helil Bey ordered every Assyrian and Armenian soldier in his army to be executed. Meanwhile, the Ottoman authorities authorized even harsher crackdowns on Assyrians and Armenians. The governor of one province said that he'd been given a simple 3-word order: yak, vor, oldur, burn, demolish, kill. One survivor of these massacres was Judad Abradova, who gave her testimony years later. Her husband was the headman of a small Assyrian village called Ardshe. When Ottoman forces arrived in her village, they burned her house down and took her husband and sons into the village square. They were beaten mercilessly as their captors ordered them to convert to Islam. When they refused, Judad was forced to watch as the soldiers executed her children one by one. Judad threw herself over her husband to protect him, but the soldiers simply kicked her off and shot him anyway. Intense violence occurred in the Hakkari Mountains and around Lake Urmia in Van province, where Assyrian tribesmen controlled many of the villages. Here, as elsewhere, the scattered Assyrian villages were attacked without mercy, and the few survivors escaped with tales of inhuman cruelty. In the village of Ardichai on the shores of Lake Urmia, for example, a group of terrified women tried to escape the soldiers by running into the water. When they refused to come back out, the Ottomans shot them and left their bodies floating in the lake. The Assyrian and Armenian genocides occurred side by side in Van province. One of the most egregious episodes of both atrocities came from Governor Cevdet Bey in the town of Haftavan. In spring 1915, he instructed all local adult Christian men to assemble in Haftavan under the pretense of distributing food. Instead, they were arrested and executed. However, the war meant that the Ottomans had to be economical with their bullets. Rather than spend precious ammunition on the prisoners, Cevdet's troops beat them to death with tools, farming equipment, and pickaxes. Before long, it was impossible to hide the events from the rest of the world. Western media printed harrowing accounts of massacres, and the Iranian government expressed disgust as the Christians who were violated and mercilessly massacred throughout the Ottoman Empire. One distraught Russian consul who had personally visited some of the massacre sites wrote in his report, "I have investigated 20 villages. Everywhere there is complete ruin and devastation. Churches, schools, and libraries have only walls remaining. The villages are full of corpses of the poor victims of massacres." The brutality shocked even the Ottoman High Command, who officially blamed the violence in Van province on Cevdet's out-of-control troops. Still, Cevdet himself faced no punishment, and his men proudly embraced their new nickname, the Butcher Battalion. The Assyrians had only 3 choices: submit, flee, or fight. Those who chose to submit were almost entirely killed or deported. Some would manage to flee, but their escape often relied upon those who had chosen to fight. In the Hakkari Mountains, that fight was led by the Catholicos, patriarch of the Church of the East, Mor Shimon. Shimon had already negotiated with the Russians for aid in 1914, and he had previously written to Cevdet Bey begging for him to stop his persecutions. When that failed, and with no existing Assyrian military or political organizations, the church leader became a figurehead of Assyrian resistance. Thousands of Assyrians in the Hakkari Mountains took up arms and did their best to oppose their would-be genociders. By April 1915, Cevdet Bey was raining artillery shells on every Assyrian village he could find. Any Assyrian, fighter or not, was punished. The Ottomans even tracked down Mor Shimon's brother in Constantinople and wrote to Shimon with a choice: tell every Assyrian to lay down their weapons or they promise to execute him. "My people are my family," Shimon wrote in reply. "They are many, and my brother is just one. Let him give his life for his nation." The Ottomans kept their word. Despite their defiant spirit, a renewed Ottoman assault in June 1915 drove the Assyrians further up into the mountains. Shimon appealed to his Russian allies for aid, which never came. With no other options, the surviving Assyrians of Hakkari province abandoned their homes and made a dangerous trek into Russia through difficult mountains with the Ottomans on their tail. Thousands died in the escape, but Shimon and about 30,000 Assyrian refugees managed to safely make it to Russian territory. Some of the worst violence occurred in the province of Diyarbakir by the command of Mehmed Reshid Bey. Reshid was an eager murderer and one of the most feared perpetrators of the Assyrian and Armenian genocides. Reshid justified his persecution of Christians by accusing them of sheltering military deserters and hiding weapons. Reshid's forces would conduct mass raids on Christian homes or churches and drag accused dissidents away to prison. They ordered Christians to turn over their weapons, and when they complied, he used these weapons as proof that the Christians were a threat and justified even more persecution. Within 2 months of arriving in Diyarbakir, he had over 1,600 Christians in jail. Reshid seemed to have no sense of morality or decency whatsoever. On May 25, 1915, he informed hundreds of imprisoned Christians that they would be spared execution and instead be deported to Mosul until the war was over. It was presented as a merciful alternative, and it seems the prisoners agreed. A week later, even though they were still in chains, the Christians sang as they were marched through the streets to boats that waited to take them away. Before stepping on board, Reshid's soldiers took their possessions and promised they'd be given back to them at Mosul. Except they were never going to Mosul. Reshid's troops carried them downriver to the valley of Besfan, where every single one was killed. Reshid's authorities even wrote letters to the families of the prisoners, claiming that they'd made it to Mosul safe and sound. Hundreds more men were massacred in this way. The women and children who remained behind faced a similarly grim fate. Many of them ended up on the infamous death marches, where sexual violence and random executions were a part of daily life, and many would never reach their supposed destinations. One German diplomat who met some of those who reached their destinations wrote how the misery of these people cannot be described. Their clothes fall from their bodies. Daily, women and children die of hunger. If you want to learn more about the horrors of the death marches, check out our video on the Armenian Genocide. In other cases, Reshaped's men took a more direct approach. Reshaped organized volunteer militias to act as death squads across his province, exterminating whole towns and villages in one go. At its worst, tens of thousands were killed every month, and thousands might die on a single day when a large town was targeted. Reshaped's actions were extreme, even for the Ottomans. On July 12, 1915, Talat Pasha himself wrote to Reshaped demanding that he restrict his killing only to the Armenians and leave the Assyrians alone for now. Reshaped simply ignored him. Barely a week later, his forces killed 7,000 more at Midyat. Their crime? Shooting back when his death squads marched into their village. Historians estimate that up to 200,000 Christians were killed in Diyarbakir under Reshaped's command, including at least 60,000 Assyrian Orthodox Christians, and the rest from other Assyrian, Armenian, and Greek denominations. Amidst all of the suffering, the Assyrians managed a few episodes of astounding resistance. The Tur Abdin region of Turkey saw two successful efforts by Assyrians to repel their attackers. The first was in the town of Ain Vardo in July 1915. Refugees had flooded into the village in early 1915 to escape attacks by Ottoman forces. The village's ancient walls were a formidable defense, and the village organized a militia to defend themselves from incoming soldiers. For almost 2 months, the Assyrians fended off a much larger number of Kurdish raiders and Ottoman troops, with little more than bolt-action rifles and determination. Their resistance forced the Ottomans to the negotiating table, but when the Assyrians still refused to lay down their weapons, the Ottomans withdrew and never returned. A similar successful resistance occurred in the town of Azar between August and November of 1915. Barely 1,000 poorly armed Assyrian militia soldiers, calling themselves the Jesus Fidai, defended the town from a much larger coalition of Ottoman and Kurdish soldiers. They mounted a bitter resistance against the attackers and forced the Ottoman military to reassign troops from elsewhere to support taking this tiny town. The Ottomans even considered calling their German allies to help, but the Germans were skeptical that this town was truly a rebel base and were uncomfortable with the widespread reports of anti-Christian atrocities, so they refused to help. In early November, a replenished Ottoman force mounted a furious assault on the village, but were beaten back. A week later, the Assyrian defenders snuck out of the town and attacked the Ottoman positions, killing officers and stealing modern military equipment before slipping back into Azar. Humiliated and with hundreds dead, the Ottomans retreated, and Talat Pasha gave the order to leave the Assyrians where they were. Thanks in large part to the resistance of these two towns, the Ottomans never completed their genocide in the Tur Abdin region, and it remains one of the only Christian majority regions of Turkey. There was no single moment where the Assyrian genocide ended. With thousands deported and the provinces of Diyarbakir and Van almost completely purged of Assyrians, the genocide was mostly complete by late 1915. Those who hadn't been killed or deported had fled, or were among the tiny few able to resist the Ottomans in their fortified villages. Assyrians were still being killed after 1915. Morshimun himself was killed by an assassin in 1918, only a few months before the collapse of the Ottoman government. However, most of the genocide's victims had been claimed. Only with the end of the First World War and the fall of Talat Pasha's government could Assyrians begin to reflect on everything they had endured. As with all genocides, the exact death toll is debatable. In Diyarbakir, as many as 200,000 Christians died, of which at least 60,000 were Assyrian. There had been 100,000 Assyrians in the Hakkari Mountains and the surrounding area. But even with more Shimun's escapees, little more than 1/3 of the population was accounted for after the war. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Assyrian representatives estimated 250,000 dead overall, amounting to about half of the known pre-war Assyrian population. Modern scholarship pushes this number closer to 300,000. The only thing as rare as certainty for a genocide is accountability. Talat Pasha and his government escaped responsibility, and only a handful of people ever faced charges, let alone conviction. One person who was charged was Mehmed Reshid, who was arrested immediately after the Ottoman surrender, but he escaped from prison in January 1919 and took his own life before the government could recapture him. For Assyrians today, the Saifo is the height of the historic persecution. Many of the areas depopulated by the genocide are still empty of Assyrians today. But although Assyrians around the world continue to push for recognition of the atrocities committed against them, Turkey insists that its predecessors did nothing wrong. In 2023, President Erdogan said the Saifo lacks legal and historical basis, and proudly asserted that Turkey does not need to take history lessons from anyone. Turkey might not learn, but a growing number of people are becoming aware of this forgotten tragedy. Still, just 4 countries, Armenia, France, Germany, and Sweden, officially recognize the genocide. Without a state of their own and being so few in number, the Assyrian fight for the recognition of their history continues to be a difficult one. Hopefully this video has helped you to recognize what happened in the Saifo. If you appreciated this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe as we explore more of history's most fascinating and disturbing secrets.